She hid Jewish families behind false walls in a wartime city crawling with German soldiers, received no medal for it, told almost no one, and then spent the final years of her life sleeping in a convent cell inside Buckingham Palace, wearing a nun's habit she had sewn herself. That is the compressed version. The full version is stranger, harder, darker, and it ends in a place nobody predicted when it began. Her name was Princess Alice of Battenberg. She was born deaf, married into the Greek royal house, institutionalized for years on the orders of Sigmund Freud, watched her family collapse in revolutions and coups, built a nursing order from almost nothing, and then, at the moment when the Germans occupied Athens in 1941, she did something that the Greek government would not formally acknowledge for decades. There is a document in the Yad Vashem archives in Jerusalem, the world authority on Holocaust memory and testimony, that names her among the righteous among the nations. Most people have never heard of her. Her own grandson spent years quietly researching what she had done before the full story came out. And even then, the full story is only part of it, because Alice of Battenberg contains several lifetimes inside one, each one more improbable than the last. By the time this is over, you will understand how a woman born at Windsor Castle into the highest reaches of European royalty ended up hiding a Jewish widow and her children in an Athens apartment while the Gestapo interrogated her downstairs. You will understand how she survived not just the war, but a psychological system that tried to erase her. And you will understand why the final image of her life, an elderly woman in gray robes padding through the corridors of Buckingham Palace, carrying nothing, is not a sad ending. It is the most defiant thing she ever did. One more thing before we get to Athens. There is a family connection in this story that almost nobody mentions when they tell it. Alice of Battenberg was the mother of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, the man who spent decades standing 3 steps behind the British Queen, dutiful and contained and largely unknowable, was the son of a woman who defied the Third Reich from an occupied apartment with no protection and no plan. That parallel matters. We will come back to it because the distance between what Philip knew about his mother and what she actually was forms the most quietly devastating revelation in the entire story. She was born on the 25th of February, 1884, at Windsor Castle, which made her arrival unusual in itself. Her great-grandmother was Queen Victoria, who was present at the birth, and whose diary entry for that day describes a healthy and apparently unremarkable child. It was only as Alice grew older that the family understood she was profoundly deaf. The precise nature of her hearing loss has been discussed in several biographical sources, including the comprehensive study by Hugo Vickers published in 2000, which draws on family papers, correspondence archives, and interviews with people who knew Alice in the final decades of her life. Vickers concludes that Alice had significant sensory neural hearing loss from birth or early infancy, and that the extent of it was not fully grasped until she was well into childhood. In the late 19th century, this was considered something close to catastrophe for a child of royal stock, not because of what it meant for Alice, but because of what it meant for her marriageability and her standing. Victoria, characteristically, refused to accept that the girl was limited by anything. She insisted Alice be trained in lip reading to a degree of precision that most people who met her as an adult had no idea she was deaf. Victoria brought in specialists. The training was intensive and began early. Alice also taught herself to read lips in multiple languages, not English and French and German as a secondary accommodation, but as the primary means of accessing the world. The precision she developed was, by multiple accounts, including those of people who worked with her during the occupation years in Athens, extraordinary. She could read lips in dim light. She could follow arguments across a dinner table. She adapted. Her father was Prince Louis of Battenberg, a German-born British naval officer who had risen, through genuine ability and relentless work, to become First Sea Lord of the Admiralty, the highest professional position in the Royal Navy. It was a remarkable achievement for a man who had come to Britain as a teenager speaking limited English. Then 1914 arrived. Germany and Britain went to war, and Louis of Battenberg, first Sea Lord, holder of the highest naval office in the land, found himself hounded from his position by press campaigns and political pressure because his name sounded German. He resigned in October of 1914, weeks after the war began. He anglicized his family name to Mountbatten. The humiliation was complete and permanent. He died in 1921, shortly after the family's second catastrophe, the exile from Greece. Alice watched both of these institutional betrayals from close range. She absorbed their lesson. She married Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark in 1903. The wedding was in Darmstadt, in Germany, at the Hessian court that had provided brides to half the royal houses of Europe. Andrew was the fourth son of King George I of Greece, born into a country that had only recently acquired a monarchy and had spent much of its subsequent existence lurching between constitutional progress and political violence. He was charming, decent, and catastrophically poorly suited for the environment he inhabited. His political instincts were minimal. His capacity for careful maneuver in a court environment was limited. He was also genuinely fond of Alice, which in that world was not nothing. Greece in the early 20th century was not a stable country. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 reshaped the map of southeastern Europe. Greece gained Thessaloniki, the great northern port, along with large portions of Macedonia and Epirus. The country's territory and population nearly doubled. The king who had presided over this expansion, George I, was assassinated in Thessaloniki in 1913, shot by a Greek anarchist. His son Constantine took the throne. Alice and Andrew had their first 4 children during this period, 4 daughters born between 1905 and 1914. Then the First World War arrived, and with it, a catastrophic rupture in Greek politics. Constantine wanted to keep Greece neutral. His prime minister, the formidably able Eleutherios Venizelos, wanted to join the Entente on the side of Britain and France. The dispute between them split the country into 2 hostile camps, and eventually forced Constantine off the throne in 1917 under pressure from the Allies. Andrew's loyalty to the king put him on the wrong side of the political divide. He was out of favor. He continued serving in the Greek army with little enthusiasm and less support. Then, in June of 1921, Alice gave birth to their 5th child and only son. They named him Philip. He was born in Mon Repose, the royal villa on the island of Corfu, a pleasant Mediterranean house that would be his home for exactly 18 months. The Greco-Turkish War, which had begun with Greek territorial ambitions in Anatolia, collapsed in August and September of 1922 in what Greeks call the catastrophe. The Turkish nationalist army under Mustafa Kemal routed the Greek forces, pushed them to the coast, and the city of Smyrna burned. The fire lasted for days. The Greek and Armenian quarters of the city were destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of refugees flooded the waterfront, trying to reach Allied ships in the harbor. The Allied commanders, not wanting to antagonize the victorious Turks, kept their ships at a distance. Photographs of the waterfront at Smyrna from those days are among the most disturbing images of the early 20th century. They show crowds of people trapped between fire and sea. The death toll has never been precisely established. Estimates range from 10,000 to over 100,000. This catastrophe destroyed the Greek political structure that had sent the army to Anatolia. A military committee of officers seized power. They needed someone to blame. They convened a tribunal. Several senior political and military figures were put on trial for high treason for their conduct during the war. 6 of them were shot by firing squad in November of 1922. They were considering Prince Andrew next. The charge against Andrew was abandonment of his post during a critical moment in the campaign. The reality was more complicated. He had commanded the 2nd Army Corps in a chaotic situation where orders from above were contradictory, and the strategic situation was deteriorating faster than anyone could respond. But military tribunals in revolutionary situations are not primarily interested in complicated realities. They are interested in visible blame and public consequences. Andrew had been a general. He was a prince. He was connected to the monarchy that the new regime had just overthrown. He was an obvious target. The British intervention was organized through a combination of diplomatic pressure and the deployment of a specific naval asset. The British government sent Commander Gerald Talbot, a naval intelligence officer who had served in Greece and had contacts in the new military government, to negotiate privately. King George V applied pressure through official channels. The Greek government, which depended on British goodwill for its financial position and for any future diplomatic support, eventually agreed. Andrew's sentence was commuted to permanent exile. He was stripped of his Greek citizenship and ordered never to return. The family left on the British light cruiser HMS Calypso. Philip, 18 months old, was carried aboard in an orange crate that a sailor had lined with blankets and improvised as a crib. They had almost nothing else. The life they had built in Greece, the status, the houses, the network of connections, all of it was gone. They would not live as a unit again. Not really. Not ever. They settled in Paris, in the suburb of Saint-Cloud, in a house lent to them by a relative. The financial reality was stark. They had royal connections and essentially no money. Andrew received a small pension from the Greek government, which was inconsistent and humiliating to request. Alice's relatives helped where they could. The 4 daughters were married off in succession to various German princes over the following years, which removed them from the household one by one. Philip was sent to school in England on the support of his British relatives, first to a preparatory school and eventually to Gordonstown, the austere Scottish school founded by Kurt Hahn, where he proved to be a capable, if somewhat difficult. What was happening to Alice during these years has been discussed with varying degrees of clinical precision by different sources. The facts are not entirely comfortable. By the late 1920s, Alice was experiencing something that the people around her found alarming. She had been a devout Greek Orthodox Christian since her marriage, having converted as a condition of marrying into the Greek royal family. The conversion had been genuine rather than merely formal. By the late 1920s, her religious engagement had deepened into something different. She described experiences that others characterized as visions. She claimed she could heal the sick through prayer and touch. She spent increasing amounts of time in churches and convents. She wanted to found a religious nursing order. Andrew thought she had lost her mind. Her relatives were frightened. Her brother Louis, by then Mountbatten and rising through the British naval hierarchy, was deeply concerned. Doctors were consulted. The name that entered the process at some point was Sigmund Freud, who was then the most famous psychiatrist in the world and who was asked to review her case. Freud's analysis, conducted without direct examination, was that her religious experiences were a manifestation of repressed sexuality, specifically frustrated sexual longing that had been sublimated into mystical religious expression. The treatment he recommended was designed to address this at its presumed biological root. The treatment was radiation of her ovaries. The goal was to eliminate her sexual drive, and thus, in the theoretical framework being applied, remove the pressure that was supposedly causing the mystical symptoms. She was 46 years old. She had borne 5 children. She was being told that her spiritual life was a symptom of unsatisfied desire, and the proposed solution was to irradiate her reproductive organs. She underwent the procedure. Then she was committed to a sanatorium in Kreuzlingen, Switzerland, the same institution where Ludwig Binswanger, a prominent psychiatrist in the existential tradition, ran a clinic for wealthy European patients. Her children were distributed. Philip went to Britain. The daughters were already in Germany with their new husbands. Andrew went to the French Riviera. Alice was in Switzerland, being treated for what her doctors were certain was a psychotic break. She spent years moving through institutions, Kreuzlingen first, then other facilities. The letters she wrote during this period, some of which are held in private family collections and have been summarized in biographical accounts, describe a woman who was in significant distress, who missed her children, who found the institutional environment oppressive, and who maintained throughout that she did not believe she was ill. She disagreed with the diagnosis. She did not find the religious experiences she had described to be symptoms of pathology. She found them meaningful. Most historians who have looked at this period agree that the diagnosis and treatment were products of their time in the worst possible sense. The application of Freudian theory to a deeply religious woman of late middle age who had survived repeated family tragedies, exile, and complete social dislocation, and who responded by deepening her spiritual practice, tells us far more about the assumptions embedded in 1930s psychiatry than it tells us about what was actually wrong with Alice. What was actually happening, most modern analysts would suggest, was that a profoundly isolated woman with no institutional role, no money, no husband, no children at home, and no country was searching for meaning and structure in the only framework that had consistently made sense to her, which was religion. She was declared recovered and released sometime in the mid-1930s, having spent approximately 3 to 4 years in institutional settings. She returned to Greece. She did not go back to Andrew, who remained in France. She began rebuilding what she could of her life. The Greece she returned to was itself in a kind of chronic political crisis. The Republic had collapsed in 1935, and the monarchy was restored under King George II, who had been in exile in England. The restoration was followed in 1936 by a quasi-fascist dictatorship under General Ioannis Metaxas, who suspended parliament and ruled by decree with the backing of the army. Alice navigated this by staying out of political matters entirely and concentrating on charitable work. She threw herself into nursing and social welfare projects among the poor of Athens. The city had significant poverty, particularly in the neighborhoods around Piraeus, and in the refugee settlements that had grown up after the 1922 population exchange that brought hundreds of thousands of Greeks from Anatolia to the Greek mainland. Many of these refugees had been living in desperate conditions for over a decade. Alice worked in these communities, not as a supervisor or patron from a safe distance, but in direct contact, visiting, providing material assistance, organizing practical help. She also pressed forward with her religious project. She wanted to create a Greek Orthodox nursing sisterhood, an active community of women who would both live in religious community and provide nursing care and social assistance to the poor. She wore gray religious robes. She attracted a small community of women who shared her vision. She negotiated with the Orthodox hierarchy for recognition of her order, to be called the Christian Sisterhood of Martha and Mary. The negotiations were slow and the support was limited, but by the late 1930s she had something, small and fragile, and hers. Then came April of 1941. Germany invaded Yugoslavia and Greece simultaneously on the 6th of April. The campaign was rapid and decisive. The Greek army, which had successfully resisted an Italian invasion from Albania through the winter of 1940-41, could not hold against the Wehrmacht. The British and Commonwealth Expeditionary Force that had arrived to help was overwhelmed. The evacuation from Greece began. Dunkirk, again, on a smaller scale, but with the same essential shape. A military failure covered by a naval operation of remarkable improvisation. The last British troops left by the end of April. The government, the king, the military command, all of them fled. Athens fell on the 27th of April. A German soldier climbed the Acropolis and raised the swastika on the ruins of the Parthenon. Alice did not leave. This requires explanation because almost everyone who could leave did. The practical reasons she had for staying are part of the record. She had her charitable work. She had her nursing sisters, small in number but dependent on her. She had her apartment, her possessions, the community she had built. She was 57 years old. She had nowhere obvious to go and no money to go there with. Andrew was in France, which would itself be under German control shortly. Her daughters were in Germany. But there was also something else. There are accounts from people who knew her during the occupation period that describe her attitude toward leaving as one of settled refusal. She would not abandon the people she had been working with. She would not leave a city she had made her home. She had been driven out of Greece once already, as an 18-month-old infant's mother watching her family loaded onto a British warship with nothing. She was not going to be driven out again. The German Occupation Administration was aware of her presence in Athens. She was, after all, a princess with clear connections to the British royal family and to several German royal houses, including the Hessian family, from which a number of senior German figures were drawn. Her 4 daughters had all married German princes, several of whom had connections to the Nazi Party or the German military. This made her, from the German occupiers' perspective, a complicated and potentially useful figure. They made contact. They were, by several accounts, relatively respectful toward her, in the way that the German occupation apparatus often was toward figures of established European aristocracy who had the right connections. Alice gave them nothing useful. She maintained an exquisite, studied neutrality. She was polite. She was confused when confusion was useful. She was deaf, which allowed her to manage conversations with a precision the other parties did not fully appreciate. When German officers visited her, she could choose how well she lip-read them. When she needed not to understand something, she did not understand it. When she needed to understand, she understood perfectly. This is not the same as collaboration. It is the strategic deployment of a disability as a tool of non-cooperation. Meanwhile, beneath this surface of harmless elderly confusion, she was building the actual operational structure of what she was doing. The Jewish community of Athens was smaller than that of Thessaloniki, which had already been catastrophically decimated. Athens had somewhere between 8 and 12,000 Jews, the estimates vary in the sources, concentrated particularly in the Monastiraki neighborhood and surrounding areas. Many had deep roots in the city. Some had arrived from Thessaloniki or other Balkan cities. They were doctors, merchants, craftsmen, scholars. They were Greeks who happened to be Jewish, most of them, and they had assumed, not unreasonably, given earlier signs, that the Italian occupation sector might treat them with somewhat more latitude than the Germans. That hope collapsed in the autumn of 1943, when the Germans took control of the former Italian occupation zone following Italy's armistice with the Allies. The Eichmann apparatus moved into Athens. Adolf Eichmann's deportation machine had already destroyed the Thessaloniki community. Now it turned south. The response of the Greek population to the deportations varied. Some collaborated. Some were indifferent. A significant number helped. The Greek Orthodox Archbishop Damaskinos wrote an open letter to the German occupation authorities protesting the deportations, signed by a notable list of Greek civic leaders, which was remarkable and relatively rare in occupied Europe at that level of institutional visibility. The letter did not stop the deportations, but it was not nothing. Smaller acts of rescue, individual decisions made by ordinary people with nothing to gain and a great deal to lose, took place across Athens. Alice was one of them. The family she chose to protect was the family of a man named Haimaki Cohen, sometimes rendered as Michael Cohen in different accounts, who had been a prominent member of the Athenian Jewish community and who had died before the German occupation. His widow, identified in the Yad Vashem testimony records as Rachel Cohen, and her adult children and grandchildren faced the same threat as every other Jewish family in occupied Athens once the deportations began. Alice took them into her apartment. The logistics of hiding people in an occupied city are rarely discussed with the specificity they deserve. The apartment was on Xenophon Street, a central Athens address that placed Alice in proximity to the German administration and to the regular movement of German military and security personnel. Feeding additional people required food, which was rationed, which meant obtaining more than her allowance through black market purchases or through charity networks, both of which involved transactions that had to be conducted without attracting attention. The Cohen family members needed to move through the apartment without being visible from the street or to neighbors who might report them. Alice had to maintain simultaneously the public-facing persona of the harmless aristocratic eccentric and the operational reality of a hidden household. She had very little help. The nursing sisterhood was small, and its members were not all aware of the full extent of what she was doing. A few trusted individuals helped obtain food, but the core of the operation was Alice herself, an elderly deaf woman in religious robes, running a hidden household and a soup kitchen simultaneously in an occupied city with the Gestapo 2 streets away. The Gestapo did come to her door. The testimony preserved at Yad Vashem and summarized in Vickers's biography describes the interrogation. The German officers asked if she was hiding anyone. She played deaf. She asked for repetition. She gave answers that were not quite answers. She was, by all accounts, convincingly confused. She was a princess. She was in her 60s. She seemed, to anyone who did not know what she actually was, like exactly the kind of harmless, well-connected eccentric who filled the margins of European aristocracy in those years. The officers left. She had faced the Gestapo across her own threshold, stone deaf, with the people she was protecting somewhere in the apartment above her, and had sent them away. This is the moment that Yad Vashem commemorates. Not a battle, not a dramatic rescue on a train platform. An old woman, deaf, in gray robes, deflecting trained interrogators through the controlled deployment of apparent confusion. The courage required is not cinematic. It is colder and harder than that. What had she been thinking? We do not know, and we should not invent it. What we can say is that the choice she made was informed by everything she had survived. She had watched her father destroyed by institutional cowardice. She had been imprisoned by institutional psychiatry. She had been exiled twice from the country she considered home. She had built a religious life from nothing in the ruins of her social position. She had learned, through decades of direct experience, that institutions did not protect the people they were supposed to protect. The only protection available was the kind you provided yourself. She had been providing it since the family arrived in Athens. After the war ended in the spring of 1945, Alice returned to what she had been doing before. The liberation of Greece was not straightforward. The country moved almost directly from German occupation to civil war. The conflict between the government in exile that returned from Cairo, backed by British forces, and the communist-led resistance movement, ELAS, which had controlled much of rural Greece during the occupation, exploded into open fighting in December of 1944, months before the German surrender. The Civil War proper continued until 1949. It was brutal, with atrocities committed by multiple sides. Civilian casualties were significant. Hundreds of thousands of people were internally displaced. The economy was devastated. Alice continued her charitable work through all of this. She continued wearing her habit. She continued trying to rebuild her nursing order. The Christian sisterhood of Martha and Mary struggled. The sisters dispersed over time, some leaving religious life, some finding other communities. The institutional recognition from the Orthodox hierarchy that Alice had sought for years remained incomplete. By the late 1950s, she was effectively the last full member of her own order. The question of what to do about her son Philip was one she had not entirely resolved. Philip had been raised in Britain, educated in Britain, had served in the Royal Navy during the Second World War with distinction, and in November of 1947 had married Princess Elizabeth, the heir apparent to the British throne. He gave up his Greek and Danish royal titles, became a British subject, took the surname Mountbatten. When Elizabeth became queen in February of 1952, Philip became consort, a role with no constitutional definition and significant personal frustration. He was, by most accounts, a man of considerable intelligence and drive who was required to subordinate both indefinitely. Alice visited occasionally. The visits were, by the accounts that survive, somewhat strained. She and Philip were not close in the way that a different history might have produced. He had spent his formative years largely without her. She had spent years in institutions. When they were together, the emotional temperature was careful. They were not estranged, but they were not easy with each other. She did not tell him what she had done. Not during the war, when the danger had passed. Not in the years afterward, when the story might have been shared safely. Not in the 1950s or 60s. She simply did not mention it. The reasons for this silence are worth considering. Alice was not, by temperament or by habit, a person who sought recognition for herself. Everything she had done throughout her life had been done without seeking external validation. She had converted her religious beliefs without advertising them. She had built her nursing order without seeking press coverage. She had hidden the Cohens without telling anyone who did not need to know. The silence after the war was consistent with everything before it. She had done what she thought was right, and the doing of it was sufficient. It did not require witnesses. There may also have been something else. Alice had been told by some of the most credentialed authorities in European medicine that her inner life was pathological. She had been locked up for it. The experience of having her own moral compass classified as a symptom of mental illness had perhaps taught her to keep that compass private, to act on it without explaining it, to let the actions speak while the reasoning remained her own. The Greek military junta that seized power in April of 1967 ended whatever remained of Alice's ability to live independently in Athens. The regime of the colonels was nationalist and deeply hostile to the royal family, which it eventually forced into exile. Alice's position became untenable. She had no Greek government support, no money, no independent means. Philip intervened. She arrived at Buckingham Palace in the late 1960s and was given rooms on an upper floor. The palace's housekeeper and staff were, by accounts that have circulated in biographical sources, uncertain how to treat her. She was a princess. She was also something else, something that did not map cleanly onto palace categories. She wore religious robes every day. She ate sparingly. She smoked. She wanted a simple room rather than elaborate apartments. She had definite opinions and no particular interest in softening them for an audience. The image of Alice of Battenberg in Buckingham Palace is genuinely strange if you hold its component parts simultaneously. A woman who had hidden Jewish refugees from the Gestapo was now living in the official residence of the British monarch, the grandmother-in-law of the sovereign, walking the carpeted corridors of one of the most heavily staffed and formally organized buildings in the world in a hand-sewn religious habit. The institution that surrounded her was perhaps the most tradition-bound in European civilization. She was perhaps the person least defined by institutional tradition of anyone inside it. She was also dying, slowly, as people do when they are old. She had survived extraordinary things, but she was in her 80s, and her health was failing. She continued to smoke. She continued to read. She continued to ask about the world. She died on the 5th of December, 1969. The palace released a brief statement. She was buried temporarily in the royal vault at Windsor, which was provisionally the least appropriate resting place imaginable for a woman who had spent 30 years trying to live as close as possible to the model of an Orthodox Christian religious life. Windsor was where the Anglican monarchy buried its dead. Alice was an Orthodox Christian who had wanted to be buried in Jerusalem. It took time. The political complications of moving royal remains from one country to another, combined with the general inertia of institutional processes, meant that Alice lay in Windsor for nearly 2 decades. In 1988, finally, her remains were transferred to Jerusalem and interred in the crypt of the Church of Mary Magdalene on the Mount of Olives. The church, built in the Russian imperial style with distinctive onion domes, stands above the Kidron Valley, overlooking the Old City. It is the church of the Jerusalem mission of the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, and it contains the remains of several members of the Romanov-connected religious women's community that had existed in Jerusalem before the First World War. Alice's Aunt Ella, Grand Duchess Elizabeth Fyodorovna of Russia, who had founded a nursing sisterhood of her own in Moscow, and who had been murdered by the Bolsheviks in 1918 and canonized by the Orthodox Church, is also buried there. Alice had wanted to be near her. The recognition from Yad Vashem came in 1994. The research that led to it had been conducted over years, piecing together testimony from the Cohen family members who had survived, cross-referencing with what was known of Alice's movements and activities during the occupation, consulting the limited documentary record of the period. Yad Vashem's standards for the designation of righteous among the nations are stringent. The testimony must be first-hand. The actions must have been taken at genuine personal risk. There must be no material compensation involved. Alice met all of these criteria. Prince Philip attended the ceremony. He was in his 70s by then, a man who had spent half a century performing the most formally constrained public role in Britain. He stood in Jerusalem and received the recognition on behalf of his mother. He said afterward, in the direct and slightly blunt way that characterized his public speech, that he had no idea she had been doing this. The not knowing carried its full weight. He had not known because she had not told him. She had not told him because she did not seek external confirmation for what she believed to be right. He had not known because the distance between them, created by her institutionalization and his exile from Greece, and the particular emotional management that characterized that generation, had meant that what she was had never quite transmitted to him. Here is a thread worth pulling. Philip was formed by absence. His mother was institutionalized when he was 9 years old. His father retreated to the French Riviera and its diversions. His sisters married into Germany and were effectively inaccessible to him once the war began, and indeed his German brothers-in-law served on the other side, one of whom died in a Luftwaffe crash in 1943. Philip had no stable home, no settled family, no permanent parent. He moved through the houses of various relatives, through school dormitories, through naval vessels. He became, by all accounts, a man who kept his interior life rigorously private and who expressed himself through action and humor rather than through feeling. His mother, whom he barely knew, was the same. She kept her interior life rigorously private and expressed herself through action rather than through feeling. She had done the most significant thing she would ever do and told nobody. He had, in the years of their cautious, careful contact, no idea that the woman sitting across from him had stared down the Gestapo. The parallels in character are striking. The tragedy is that the character could not transmit itself because the relationship through which it might have traveled had been severed too early. He spent the last years of his life, before his death in April of 2021, with the knowledge of what his mother had been. It took Yad Vashem and decades of research to give it back to him. He had missed it while she was alive. The central question this story poses is not what Alice did. The record on that is clear enough. The question it poses is why the record was so nearly lost. Why a woman who had done something so significant at such personal cost spent decades being remembered primarily as Prince Philip's complicated, eccentric, mentally unstable mother. Why the institutional machinery that surrounds European royalty had so thoroughly processed her into a minor and slightly tragic footnote. Part of the answer is that she wanted it that way. She did not seek recognition. She did not write her memoirs. She did not speak to journalists. The story could only emerge after her death, built from testimony and archival fragments and the patient research of people like Hugo Vickers and the teams at Yad Vashem. Part of the answer is that the institutions around her had always had trouble seeing her accurately. The Edwardian medical establishment had seen her deafness as a problem to be managed. The 1930s psychiatric establishment had seen her religious conviction as a symptom to be treated. The German occupation had seen her as a harmless, aristocratic eccentric. Even her own family, the one that built the world's most heavily documented royal archive, had not known what she had done. She had spent her entire life operating in the gap between who institutions thought she was and who she actually was. It was in that gap that she had hidden the Cohens. It was in that gap that she had deflected the Gestapo. It was in that gap, in gray robes in Buckingham Palace, smoking, reading, waiting to be taken to Jerusalem, that she had lived the final years that the world would only later understand. The tree planted for her in the Avenue of the Righteous at Yad Vashem grows in good soil. The avenue is a long approach planted with carob trees, each one named for a person recognized by the institution. Each tree represents a decision made in a particular moment, under particular pressure, to do the particular thing that the person believed was right. You can walk the avenue. You can read the names. Tell us in the comments which part of this story they never taught in school. Her son Philip went to stand under that tree in 1994, a man in his 70s who had not known what his mother was, receiving a recognition she would have found excessive. The tree for Alice of Battenberg grows in Jerusalem. Her grave is in the Church of Mary Magdalene on the Mount of Olives, a few hundred meters from where the city's oldest stories were written. Her name in the Yad Vashem archive is filed under Righteous Among the Nations, alphabetically, among thousands of other names. She would have preferred it that way. There is one more detail, small and precise, that belongs here at the end. During the most dangerous period of the occupation, when she was hiding the Cohen family, Alice was also operating a public soup kitchen for the desperately poor of her Athens neighborhood. The famine of 1941 to 42 was real, and it was lethal. Greeks were dying of starvation in a city under military occupation while German forces requisitioned food. Alice ran the soup kitchen on almost nothing, feeding people who had nothing to eat. And she ran it simultaneously with the hidden household upstairs. Think about the operational reality of that. An elderly deaf woman in religious robes managing two operations at once, in occupied territory, with the Gestapo available for consultation 2 streets away. The soup kitchen was public, visible, known to the neighborhood and presumably to the occupation authorities. The hidden family was invisible, known to almost nobody. Both required daily attention, daily supply, daily management. She held both simultaneously, neither compromising the other, for months. The German officers who came to interrogate her had every resource advantage. She had nothing, except the gap between who they thought she was and who she actually was. She had weaponized that gap so thoroughly over so many decades that by the time they arrived, she was better at exploiting it than they were at penetrating it. She was stone deaf, and they thought that was a vulnerability. It was not. It was a precision instrument. When Vickers published his biography in 2000, he drew on materials that had not previously been brought together in a single account. The sources included family papers held in private collections, the Yad Vashem testimony files, correspondence in the Royal Archives, and interviews with people who had known Alice in her final decades. The picture that emerged was substantially different from the footnote version, the minor eccentric member of the extended royal family that had preceded it. The response to the recognition has been interesting in its own right. Alice has become, in the years since the Yad Vashem designation and since the Vickers biography, a figure of genuine historical interest. Her story has been told in documentaries. The Greek government has named a street in Athens after her. Schools have used her as an example. She has become, belatedly, the kind of figure that the world tends to create when it discovers someone it should have been paying attention to decades earlier. This belated recognition is, in its own way, a continuation of the pattern her life established. The world did not see her clearly when she was alive. It is trying to see her more clearly now. It is not entirely succeeding because the full complexity of who she was, the deaf princess who was irradiated and institutionalized on Freud's recommendation and who then hid Jewish families from the Gestapo and then lived in Buckingham Palace as a nun, does not compress into any of the available narrative categories. She is not simply a hero. She is not simply a tragic figure. She is not simply an eccentric. She is all of those things at once, and the refusal to be reducible to any of them is perhaps the most consistent thing about her. Her nursing order, the Christian Sisterhood of Martha and Mary, formally dissolved after her death with no surviving members. The institution she had spent decades trying to build did not outlast her. The thing she tried to build institutionally failed. The thing she did personally succeeded beyond any measure she would have applied to it. 2 of the 3 children she sheltered in that Athens apartment survived the war and the occupation. Their testimony, given to Yad Vashem decades later, is what finally gave the world the evidence it needed to see what she had done. Rachel Cohen, the widow she sheltered, had died by then. The names of the children are in the Yad Vashem files. Their grandchildren exist. There are people alive today who exist because an elderly deaf woman in gray religious robes in an occupied apartment on Xenophon Street in Athens in 1943 looked at German officers across her own threshold and chose not to give them anything useful. The file at Yad Vashem is cross-referenced under her full title, Princess Victoria Alice Elizabeth Julia Marie of Battenberg, later Princess Andrew of Greece and Denmark, known as Princess Alice of Battenberg. The reference number is in the archive. The tree is in the avenue. She is buried in Jerusalem in the church she wanted, next to the aunt she loved, in the city whose name appears in the oldest book she ever read.